Have you ever wondered what happens when the most powerful men in England gather behind closed doors, away from prying eyes, in the depths of abandoned monasteries? What secrets would you uncover if you could peer through the shadows of history's most scandalous gatherings? Tonight, I'm going to take you into a world that polite society desperately tried to forget. A world where aristocrats shed their public masks and indulged in rituals so shocking that even mentioning them could destroy reputations. This isn't just another story about rich men behaving badly. This is the untold truth about England's most notorious secret society, where political power mixed with unholy pleasure, and where the line between satire and sacrilege disappeared entirely. What I'm about to reveal will change how you see 18th century England forever. Because beneath the powdered wigs and proper etiquette, beneath the grand estates and parliamentary debates, there existed a hidden brotherhood that mocked everything their world held sacred. They called themselves many things, but history remembers them by one name that still sends chills down the spine of anyone who truly understands what went on in those candlelit chambers: the Hellfire Club. But here's what makes this story absolutely fascinating. These weren't just wealthy degenerates playing dress-up. These were the men who shaped nations, who held the future of empires in their hands. Cabinet ministers, members of parliament, influential lords who could topple governments with a whispered word. By day, they presented themselves as pillars of Christian virtue and moral authority. By night, they descended into underground grottos where they performed rituals that would make the devil himself blush. And the man who orchestrated it all, Sir Francis Dashwood, a baronet whose public persona was so respectable that he served as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Yet this same man created a sanctuary for the most depraved fantasies of England's elite, a place where power and perversion danced together in the flickering light of black candles. Picture this scene with me for a moment. The year is 1755. Deep beneath the rolling hills of Buckinghamshire, in chambers carved from solid chalk, wealthy gentlemen in hooded robes gather around tables laden with forbidden delicacies, the air thick with incense and wine, shadows dancing on ancient walls, and in the center of it all, ceremonies that mock the very foundations of Christian England. This wasn't just rebellion. This was revolution wrapped in ritual, politics disguised as pleasure. What happened in those underground chambers wasn't just about shocking society. It was about something far more dangerous. These men were experimenting with ideas that would reshape the world. Religious skepticism that challenged the divine right of kings. Political philosophies that questioned the very structure of government. Sexual liberation that defied centuries of moral teaching. They weren't just breaking rules, they were rewriting them entirely. The genius of Sir Francis Dashwood lay not just in his ability to gather these powerful men together, but in how he created an environment where they could explore their darkest impulses without consequence. He understood that true power comes from shared secrets, from mutual vulnerability, from creating bonds that transcend normal social boundaries. Every member of his inner circle held devastating secrets about every other member. It was the perfect insurance policy against betrayal. But the Hellfire Club was more than just insurance. It was theatre on the grandest scale. Dashwood transformed abandoned religious sites into stages for elaborate performances that blurred the line between reality and fantasy. Members didn't just attend meetings, they became characters in an ongoing drama where they could safely explore ideas and desires that would destroy them in the outside world. Think about the psychological brilliance of this approach. These were men who spent their days constrained by rigid social expectations, who had to carefully measure every word and action for political impact. The club offered them a space to be completely authentic, to express thoughts and desires they could never voice elsewhere. It was therapy disguised as debauchery, philosophy hidden behind blasphemy. The location itself was carefully chosen for maximum psychological impact. West Wycombe, Dashwood's estate, sat atop a network of caves that had been carved out over centuries. These weren't natural formations. They were man-made labyrinths that stretched deep into the earth, creating a literal underworld where normal rules didn't apply. The symbolism was perfect. Above ground, the members maintained their respectable facades. Below ground, they could descend into their true selves. Dashwood spent years preparing these caves, transforming them from simple chalk mines into an elaborate temple complex. He created chambers for different purposes, private meditation rooms where members could contemplate forbidden texts, communal halls where they gathered for their infamous banquets, and at the very heart of the complex, a sanctum sanctorum where the most secret rituals took place, ceremonies so shocking that even now, centuries later, historians debate what actually happened behind those carved stone doors. The transformation of these caves tells us everything we need to know about Dashwood's vision. This wasn't a casual gathering of like-minded individuals. This was an institution built to last, designed to serve multiple generations of England's elite. Every detail was carefully planned, from the classical statues that lined the corridors to the elaborate ventilation system that kept the air breathable deep underground. Dashwood wasn't just creating a club. He was building a legacy, and what a legacy it became. The membership reads like a who's who of 18th century power. John Wilkes, the radical politician whose battles for press freedom would influence the American Constitution. The Earl of Sandwich, whose political machinations shaped British foreign policy for decades. Benjamin Franklin, yes, that Benjamin Franklin, whose presence in the club reveals connections between the American Revolution and these secret English gatherings that historians are only now beginning to understand. Each member brought their own expertise, their own connections, their own secrets to share. The club became a nexus where political intelligence flowed freely, where business deals were struck in whispered conversations, where the future of nations was debated over goblets of wine in chambers lit only by candles. It was networking on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the modern era, but with a twist that made it infinitely more powerful. The shared transgression created bonds that ordinary business relationships could never match. The rituals themselves were masterpieces of psychological manipulation. Dashwood understood that human beings are fundamentally tribal creatures, that we bond most strongly through shared experiences that set us apart from others. By creating ceremonies that were simultaneously thrilling and terrifying, sacred and profane, he forged connections between members that transcended normal social boundaries. These weren't just friends or business associates. They were brothers in the truest sense, bound together by experiences they could never share with anyone else. But perhaps most importantly, the club served as a laboratory for ideas that were reshaping the world. The Enlightenment wasn't just an intellectual movement. It was a revolution in human consciousness, and that revolution needed spaces where dangerous thoughts could be safely explored. The Hellfire Club provided exactly that space, a place where England's most influential men could experiment with concepts that would eventually transform Western civilization. Religious skepticism, political radicalism, sexual liberation, economic innovation. These weren't just abstract philosophical concepts to the members of the Hellfire Club. They were lived experiences, ideas tested in the crucible of ritual and refined through years of secretive practice. When these men returned to their public lives, they carried with them insights that would reshape everything from parliamentary procedure to colonial policy. The club's influence extended far beyond England's borders. Members travelled throughout Europe and the American colonies, carrying with them networks of connection and influence that spanned continents. The ideas debated in those underground chambers would eventually surface in the salons of Paris, the coffee houses of Boston, the halls of the Continental Congress. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the birth of modern democracy itself, All bear the fingerprints of conversations that began in the depths of West Wycomb's caves. And yet, for all their influence, the members maintained absolute discretion about their activities. The club operated for decades without a single significant leak, without a single member breaking the code of silence that protected them all. This wasn't just loyalty. This was survival. Every member understood that exposure would mean not just personal ruin, but the collapse of networks that had taken decades to build. The secrecy was maintained through a combination of mutual vulnerability and genuine affection. These men didn't just share secrets, they shared experiences that created deep emotional bonds. They laughed together, debated together, explored the boundaries of human experience together. The club became a second family, one that in many ways was more important to them than their biological families. But secrecy came at a cost. The very discretion that protected the club also limited its direct influence on history. We can trace connections, identify members, piece together fragments of their activities, but the full extent of their impact remains hidden in shadows. How many political decisions were influenced by conversations that took place in those underground chambers? How many historical events were shaped by alliances forged in the flickering candlelight of the Hellfire Club's rituals? The psychological toll of maintaining such elaborate deception was enormous. These were men living double lives on a scale that's difficult to imagine today. By day, they were respected members of society, pillars of their communities, leaders who commanded respect and admiration. By night, they descended into a world where everything they publicly stood for was turned upside down, where they could explore aspects of themselves that would horrify their constituents. This constant shifting between personas created a unique form of cognitive flexibility. Club members became masters of adaptation, able to navigate complex social situations with an ease that their contemporaries found almost supernatural. They could speak the language of religious devotion to bishops in the morning and debate atheistic philosophy with fellow members in the evening. They could defend traditional morality in Parliament and explore sexual taboos in the privacy of the caves. This duality shaped their approach to power in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. Traditional aristocrats wielded authority through birthright and convention. Club members wielded it through psychological sophistication, through an understanding of human nature that came from exploring its darkest corners. They knew how to read people because they had learned to read themselves, to navigate the complex terrain of their own hidden desires and secret fears. The recruitment process for new members was itself a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Dashwood didn't simply invite wealthy men to join his club. He identified individuals who were already struggling with the constraints of their public roles, men who showed signs of intellectual curiosity or moral rebellion that could be carefully cultivated. The invitation came gradually, through a series of seemingly innocent social gatherings that slowly revealed the true nature of what lay beneath. First, there might be a dinner party at West Wycombe where the conversation turned to classical philosophy, where questions about religious doctrine were raised with just enough subtlety to gauge the guest's reaction. If the response was promising, there might be a tour of the estate's more conventional features, perhaps a visit to the church that Dashwood had built above the caves, its golden globe gleaming in the sunlight, while darker mysteries lay hidden in the earth below. Only when a potential member had demonstrated both discretion and genuine interest would they receive an invitation to descend into the caves themselves. That first journey into the underground chambers was designed as a test of nerve and commitment. The narrow passages, the flickering shadows, the gradual revelation of the club's true nature, all combined to create an experience that separated the genuinely committed from the merely curious. Those who passed this initial test found themselves inducted into a world that challenged every assumption they had held about society, morality, and their own nature. The formal initiation ceremonies were elaborate affairs that combined elements of ancient mystery religions with Dashwood's own theatrical imagination. New members were required to take oaths that bound them not just to secrecy, but to a new understanding of their place in the world. The psychological impact of these initiations cannot be overstated. Men who had spent their entire lives defining themselves through their public roles suddenly found themselves part of something that existed entirely outside the normal structures of society. They were no longer just earls or members of parliament or wealthy merchants. They were initiates in a mystery that predated Christianity, participants in rituals that connected them to something ancient and powerful, and completely at odds with everything their world claimed to value. The regular meetings that followed maintained this sense of otherworldly significance while serving very practical purposes. The famous banquets weren't just occasions for indulgence, though they certainly included elements that would shock contemporary sensibilities. They were carefully orchestrated events where business was conducted, alliances were forged, and information was exchanged in ways that would be impossible in normal social settings. Consider the genius of conducting serious political negotiations while everyone involved was dressed in monks' robes, gathered in chambers decorated with pagan symbols, dining on foods that deliberately evoked forbidden pleasures. The theatrical setting created a psychological distance from normal moral constraints that allowed for discussions that would be unthinkable in daylight hours. Members could explore radical political ideas, question fundamental assumptions about government and society, and make deals that bent or broke conventional rules, all while maintaining the fiction that they were merely playing elaborate games. The sexual elements of the club's activities, while certainly present, served similar psychological functions. This wasn't simply about wealthy men indulging their appetites, though that was certainly part of it. It was about creating shared experiences that bound members together through mutual vulnerability and transgression. In a society where sexual propriety was rigidly enforced, where a single scandal could destroy a man's career and social standing, the club offered a space where members could explore aspects of themselves that had to remain hidden everywhere else. The presence of women at club gatherings adds another layer of complexity to our understanding of what actually took place in those underground chambers. These weren't random encounters or simple prostitution, as some later accounts would suggest. The women who participated in club activities were carefully chosen for their intelligence, discretion, and ability to contribute to the sophisticated social dynamics that Dashwood was orchestrating. Many were educated courtesans who understood the political and social implications of what they were witnessing. Others were actresses or artists who brought their own creative perspectives to the club's theatrical elements. Some may have been the wives or mistresses of members themselves, women who shared their partner's intellectual curiosity and appetite for transgression. The exact nature of their participation remains one of the club's most closely guarded secrets, but their presence clearly served purposes beyond mere physical pleasure. The religious mockery that gave the club much of its notoriety was perhaps the most psychologically complex aspect of their activities. On the surface, the black masses and inverted Christian rituals appear to be simple blasphemy, the wealthy thumbing their noses at conventional morality. But the reality was far more sophisticated and dangerous to the established order. Christianity in 18th century England wasn't just a religious system. It was the ideological foundation that justified the entire social and political structure. The divine right of kings, the moral authority of the aristocracy, the obligation of the poor to accept their station in life. All of these concepts depended on the acceptance of Christian doctrine as literal truth. By systematically mocking and inverting these beliefs, club members weren't just being irreverent, they were engaging in a form of ideological warfare that struck at the very heart of their society's power structure. The psychological liberation that came from this religious rebellion was profound. Men who had spent their entire lives constrained by Christian moral teaching suddenly found themselves free to explore ideas and behaviors that had been forbidden since childhood. The relief was intoxicating, but it was also terrifying. Without the familiar boundaries of conventional morality, how could they know where to draw new lines? How could they maintain any sense of ethical grounding while simultaneously rejecting the ethical system that had shaped their entire civilization? This tension between liberation and chaos was one of the driving forces behind the club's elaborate ritual structure. Dashwood understood that humans need boundaries, that complete moral freedom leads not to enlightenment, but to psychological breakdown. The club's ceremonies provided new boundaries, new structures within which members could safely explore their expanded freedom. The rituals weren't just theatre, they were psychological technology, carefully designed to allow for maximum exploration while maintaining enough structure to prevent complete moral collapse. The political implications of this religious rebellion were staggering. If Christian doctrine wasn't divinely inspired truth, then what justification existed for the authority of Christian monarchs? If traditional moral teaching was merely human convention, then what prevented the complete restructuring of society along more rational lines? These questions, explored in the safety of the club's underground chambers, would eventually surface in the political upheavals that transformed the Western world. The club's influence on the American colonial situation provides a perfect example of how these underground discussions translated into historical action. Several members had extensive business interests in the colonies, while others held official positions that gave them direct influence over colonial policy. The radical ideas about government and individual liberty that were debated in the caves found their way into official documents, policy decisions, and private correspondence that shaped the relationship between Britain and her American territories. Benjamin Franklin's membership in the club takes on new significance when viewed in this context. His presence wasn't just that of a curious colonial observing the decadent habits of English aristocrats. He was an active participant in discussions that were reshaping fundamental concepts about the nature of government, the source of political authority, and the rights of individuals to resist unjust rule. The ideas that would later appear in the Declaration of Independence had their origins, at least in part, in conversations that took place around candlelit tables deep beneath the English countryside. The psychological profiles of individual members reveal the complex motivations that drew men to such a dangerous association. Take John Wilkes, whose public career was marked by increasingly radical challenges to governmental authority. His participation in the club provided him with both the intellectual framework and the political connections necessary to wage his battles against press censorship and arbitrary imprisonment. The courage required for his public stands may well have been forged in the psychological crucible of the club's initiation rituals and ongoing ceremonies. Similarly, the Earl of Sandwich's notorious reputation for both political cunning and personal excess makes perfect sense when viewed through the lens of his club membership. The psychological flexibility required to navigate between his public role as a government minister and his private participation in blasphemous rituals created exactly the kind of adaptive intelligence that made him so formidable in political negotiations. His ability to compartmentalize conflicting aspects of his personality became a significant advantage in the complex world of 18th century politics. The club's economic impact extended far beyond the personal fortunes of its members. The networks of trust and mutual obligation that developed through shared transgression created unprecedented opportunities for business cooperation and financial innovation. Members could enter into agreements that would be impossible between conventional business partners because their mutual vulnerability created ironclad guarantees of discretion and reliability. Major trading ventures, banking arrangements, and investment opportunities flowed through club connections in ways that gave members significant advantages over their competitors. The psychological bonds created through ritual participation translated directly into economic benefits that compounded over decades of association. Some of England's most successful commercial enterprises of the period can trace their origins to handshake agreements made in the depths of West Wycomb's caves. The psychological warfare being waged in those underground chambers extended beyond simple religious mockery. Dashwood had created something far more sophisticated, a systematic program of mental liberation that challenged every assumption his members had ever held about reality itself. The club wasn't just questioning Christian doctrine, it was dismantling the entire conceptual framework that held English society together. Members were encouraged to explore philosophical systems that had been forbidden in England for centuries. Ancient Greek mysteries, Roman paganism, Egyptian mysticism, all became subjects of serious study and practical experimentation. The library at West Wycombe housed texts that could result in charges of heresy if discovered by the wrong authorities. But more than just reading about these forbidden ideas, members actively incorporated them into their lives through carefully designed ritual practices. The transformation this created in individual psychology was profound. Men who had been raised to see the world in terms of absolute moral categories suddenly found themselves operating in a realm where everything was relative, where truth itself became a matter of perspective rather than divine revelation. This cognitive shift didn't just affect their private lives, it fundamentally altered how they approached their public responsibilities. A member serving in Parliament no longer saw laws as expressions of divine will transmitted through royal authority. Instead, he understood them as human constructs that could be modified, improved, or completely replaced based on rational analysis and practical necessity. This perspective made them incredibly effective politicians because they could navigate complex negotiations without being constrained by rigid ideological positions. The club's approach to sexuality reveals another layer of their psychological sophistication. This wasn't the crude debauchery that later critics would describe, but rather a systematic exploration of human desire as a fundamental force that shaped all social and political relationships. Members studied classical texts on sexuality, experimented with different forms of physical and emotional intimacy, and developed theories about the connection between sexual liberation and political freedom. These explorations had practical applications that extended far beyond personal pleasure. Understanding the sexual motivations of political opponents became a powerful tool for manipulation and control. Knowing how to satisfy or frustrate these desires created leverage that could be used in negotiations, blackmail schemes, or simple social positioning. The club's members became masters of psychological manipulation, not through cruelty, but through deep understanding of human nature in all its complexity. The presence of sophisticated women in these activities adds another dimension to our understanding of what was actually taking place. These weren't passive participants or simple objects of male desire, but active contributors to the intellectual and emotional life of the organization. Many possessed educations that rivaled or exceeded those of their male counterparts, bringing perspectives on literature, philosophy, and politics that enriched the club's discussions immeasurably. Some of these women maintained correspondence with leading intellectuals across Europe, creating information networks that gave the club access to the latest developments in science, philosophy, and political theory. Others were accomplished artists whose creative work reflected and developed the aesthetic principles that guided the club's elaborate ceremonies. Their presence transformed what could have been simple masculine bonding into something far more complex and psychologically rich. The economic implications of these relationships were staggering. Women connected to the club often controlled significant fortunes in their own right, whether through inheritance, business acumen, or strategic marriages. The trust relationships developed through intimate association created opportunities for financial cooperation that would have been impossible through conventional business channels. Entire industries were influenced by investment decisions made by women who had gained their financial intelligence through participation in the club's activities. The architectural transformation of West Wycombe itself tells a fascinating story about the club's evolution from simple gathering place to elaborate temple complex. Dashwood spent decades modifying both the underground caves and the surface buildings to create a unified symbolic environment that reinforced the psychological work being done by club activities. The famous church built atop the cave system wasn't just architectural whimsy. It was a deliberate inversion of traditional religious symbolism, a statement about the relationship between surface respectability and underground truth. Visitors attending conventional religious services in the church above had no idea that beneath their feet, members were engaged in ceremonies that challenged everything the church represented. The golden ball that topped the church spire became a gathering place for smaller, more intimate meetings between core members. This wasn't just a convenient location. The symbolism was profound, suggesting that ultimate truth lay not in the heavens toward which the spire pointed, but in the earthbound sphere where human beings could gather to share their most honest thoughts and feelings. The landscape design around the estate incorporated elements from multiple religious and philosophical traditions, creating a visual environment that prepared visitors psychologically for the transformative experiences awaiting them underground. Classical statues, mysterious grottos, carefully planned sightlines, all combined to create a sense of stepping outside normal reality and entering a space where different rules applied. The cave system itself was expanded and modified over many years to serve increasingly sophisticated purposes. What began as simple chalk mines became an elaborate underground complex with specialized chambers for different activities. The famous River Styx, an underground waterway that members crossed in boats during certain ceremonies, wasn't a natural feature, but a carefully engineered element designed to enhance the psychological impact of ritual participation. The deeper chambers, accessible only to the most trusted members, contained elements that remain mysterious even today. Archaeological investigations have revealed carved symbols, hidden passages, and architectural features that suggest purposes beyond simple gathering spaces. These areas may have served as repositories for sensitive documents, meeting places for the most dangerous political discussions, or sites for rituals so secret that no records of them have ever surfaced. The club's influence on artistic and literary culture was profound, but largely hidden from contemporary observers. Members patronized artists, writers, and musicians, whose work reflected the philosophical and aesthetic principles being developed through club activities. The seemingly conventional portraits, landscape paintings, and architectural projects they commissioned often contained coded references to club beliefs and experiences that were invisible to outside observers, but meaningful to those who understood the symbolic language being employed. Literature was particularly affected by club influence. Several members were accomplished writers themselves, while others supported authors whose work pushed against conventional moral and political boundaries. The satirical tradition that flourished in 18th century England owes much to techniques of social criticism that were perfected in the club's underground chambers, where members learned to use humor and irony as weapons against established authority. The club's approach to music reveals another aspect of their sophisticated understanding of psychology and social manipulation. The ceremonies weren't conducted in silence, but were accompanied by carefully chosen musical compositions that enhanced their emotional and spiritual impact. Some pieces were traditional religious music played in deliberately inappropriate contexts, creating psychological tension through the juxtaposition of familiar melodies with transgressive activities. Other musical elements were composed specifically for club use, incorporating harmonies and rhythms designed to induce altered states of consciousness or emotional vulnerability. Members who were accomplished musicians contributed original compositions that reflected their understanding of how sound could be used to manipulate mood, enhance group bonding, and facilitate the kind of psychological transformation that was central to the club's mission. The seasonal cycle of club activities was carefully planned to maximize psychological impact while minimizing the risk of discovery. Major ceremonies coincided with traditional religious holidays, creating deliberate contrasts between what members were expected to be doing publicly and what they were actually doing privately. Christmas, Easter, and other Christian festivals became occasions for the most elaborate inversions of conventional religious practice. The summer months, when members' London responsibilities were reduced and country estates became centres of social activity, provided opportunities for extended gatherings that could last for days or even weeks. These longer sessions allowed for deeper psychological work, more elaborate ceremonies, and the kind of intensive relationship building that created the powerful bonds holding the organisation together. Winter meetings, by contrast, were often smaller and more focused on practical matters. The harsh weather and limited daylight provided natural cover for secretive activities, while the season's association with death and renewal made it psychologically appropriate for the kind of transformative work the club was attempting to facilitate. The club's international connections were more extensive than most historians have recognised. Members travelled throughout Europe and the American colonies, carrying with them not just personal relationships, but institutional knowledge that influenced political and cultural developments across the Atlantic world. The ideas debated in West Wycomb's caves found expression in the salons of Paris, the coffeehouses of Boston, and the philosophical societies of Philadelphia. These international networks created opportunities for intelligence gathering and political manipulation on a scale that individual governments couldn't match. Club members often possessed more accurate information about foreign political developments than official diplomatic channels could provide, giving them significant advantages in business negotiations, investment decisions, and political maneuvering. The revolutionary upheavals that transformed the Western world in the late 18th century bear the unmistakable influence of ideas that were first explored in the club's underground chambers. The concept of natural rights, the critique of traditional authority, the emphasis on individual liberty over collective obligation, all can be traced to philosophical discussions that took place among members who later found themselves in positions to implement these radical concepts in real-world political situations. The American Declaration of Independence, with its revolutionary assertion that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed rather than divine appointment, reflects political theories that were debated and refined through years of club discussions. The French revolutionary emphasis on reason over tradition, individual merit over inherited status, and popular sovereignty over royal prerogative, similarly shows the influence of ideas that were first tested in the psychological laboratory of Dashwood's secret society. The club's approach to education was far ahead of its time, anticipating developments in psychology and pedagogy that wouldn't become mainstream for another century. Members understood that true learning required more than simple transmission of information from teacher to student. It required the kind of emotional engagement and personal transformation that could only be achieved through carefully designed experiential education. The initiation process itself was a masterclass in educational psychology, using controlled stress, symbolic imagery, and group dynamics to create learning experiences that were far more effective than conventional academic instruction. New members didn't just learn about the club's philosophy and practices. They lived them, internalized them, made them part of their fundamental understanding of reality. This educational approach had profound implications for how members raised their own children and influenced the younger generation. Rather than simply passing on conventional wisdom and traditional values, they encouraged intellectual curiosity, moral flexibility, and the kind of psychological resilience required to navigate an increasingly complex world. The club's legacy extended far beyond its official dissolution in the late 18th century. The networks of relationship and influence that had been created through decades of shared experience continued to operate long after the formal meetings ended. Members remained connected through business partnerships, political alliances, and personal friendships that shaped British and American development well into the 19th century. More importantly, The club had demonstrated that alternative forms of social organization were possible, that the rigid hierarchies and moral constraints of traditional society weren't natural laws, but human conventions that could be modified or replaced entirely. This realization would continue to influence political and social movements for generations, providing both inspiration and practical knowledge for those seeking to create more rational and humane forms of human organization. The psychological techniques developed through club activities became part of the toolkit used by later reformers, revolutionaries, and social innovators. The understanding of group dynamics, the use of ritual to create emotional bonds, the power of shared transgression to build trust and loyalty, all became standard elements in the arsenal of those seeking to create social change. Even today, elements of the club's approach can be seen in everything from corporate team-building exercises to political organizing strategies. The recognition that human beings are fundamentally tribal creatures who bond most strongly through shared intense experiences has become a cornerstone of modern psychology and sociology, though few recognize its origins in the candlelit chambers beneath the English countryside. The club's ultimate achievement may have been its demonstration that secrecy itself could be a form of power, that hidden knowledge and private relationships could be more influential than public authority and official position. In an age increasingly dominated by mass communication and democratic participation, the Hellfire Club's model of elite organization, operating outside normal social constraints, provided a template that continues to influence how power is exercised in the modern world. The shadows cast by those underground chambers stretch far into our contemporary reality, reminding us that the most significant changes in human history often begin not in public forums or official institutions, but in private gatherings of individuals willing to question everything their society takes for granted and bold enough to act on the insights that emerge from such questioning. The psychological architecture that Dashwood constructed went far deeper than elaborate ceremonies and underground chambers. He understood something that most people in his era couldn't even conceptualize: that human identity itself was malleable, that the carefully constructed personas his members presented to the world were nothing more than masks that could be removed, modified, or replaced entirely. Think about what this meant for men who had spent their entire lives believing they were fixed entities, defined by birth, station, and divine appointment. Suddenly they found themselves in an environment where they could experiment with different versions of themselves, where they could explore aspects of their personality that had been suppressed since childhood. The liberation was intoxicating, but it was also deeply unsettling. The club became a laboratory for identity transformation on a scale that wouldn't be understood by mainstream psychology for another 2 centuries. Members learned to consciously shift between different modes of being depending on their environment and objectives. They developed what we might today call multiple personalities, though these weren't pathological splits, but rather sophisticated tools for navigating an increasingly complex social and political landscape. This ability to consciously modify their identity gave club members enormous advantages in their public lives. They could become whatever their audience needed them to be, shifting seamlessly between roles as circumstances demanded. A member negotiating with religious authorities could genuinely embody the persona of a devout Christian, drawing on authentic memories of faith from before his transformation. The same man, hours later, could argue atheistic philosophy with equal conviction because he had learned to access that aspect of his personality with equal authenticity. The women associated with the club played crucial roles in developing these identity-shifting techniques. Many came from theatrical backgrounds where they had already mastered the art of becoming different people on demand. They brought professional expertise in character development, emotional authenticity, and the subtle physical adjustments that make persona changes convincing to outside observers. These women served as coaches, helping male members develop more sophisticated approaches to identity manipulation. They taught them how to modify their posture, voice, and facial expressions to match their chosen persona. More importantly, they helped them understand how to access genuine emotions associated with different identity states, making their performances psychologically authentic rather than mere theatrical display. The sexual dynamics within the club served multiple functions beyond simple pleasure or bonding. Physical intimacy became another tool for identity exploration, allowing members to experience themselves as different types of people in the most fundamental way possible. The vulnerability required for genuine sexual connection created opportunities for personality shifts that couldn't be achieved through intellectual exercise alone. Partners could guide each other through identity transformations, using physical and emotional intimacy to access buried aspects of personality that had been suppressed by social conditioning. A member might discover aggressive tendencies that had been hidden beneath a lifetime of aristocratic refinement, or find unexpected capacity for tenderness that contradicted his public reputation for ruthless political maneuvering. These discoveries weren't just personally liberating, they provided practical intelligence about human nature that could be applied in political and business situations. Understanding the hidden aspects of their own personalities gave members insight into the secret motivations of others, making them extraordinarily effective at predicting and manipulating human behavior in their public roles. The club's approach to intoxication was similarly sophisticated. This wasn't simple drunkenness or drug abuse, but rather the systematic use of altered consciousness as a tool for psychological exploration. Different substances were employed for different purposes, each carefully chosen to facilitate specific types of mental and emotional work. Wine was used to lower inhibitions and facilitate the kind of honest communication that was essential for building trust between members. Stronger spirits served to break down the psychological barriers that prevented access to suppressed memories and emotions. Other substances, imported from distant parts of the British Empire, induced more profound alterations of consciousness that allowed for experiences that members described as spiritual or mystical. The timing and dosage of these substances was carefully controlled to maximize their psychological benefits while minimizing their dangers. Members weren't simply getting intoxicated for pleasure, they were using mind-altering substances as precision instruments for consciousness exploration, guided by individuals who had spent years studying their effects and developing techniques for directing their influence towards specific psychological objectives. The knowledge gained through these experiments had immediate practical applications. Members learned to recognize the subtle signs of intoxication in others, giving them advantages in negotiations where alcohol was present. They understood how different substances affected judgment and decision-making, allowing them to choose optimal times for important conversations or to deliberately impair opponents who didn't share their sophisticated understanding of chemical consciousness manipulation. The club's library deserves special attention as one of the most remarkable collections of forbidden knowledge ever assembled in England. Dashwood spent decades acquiring texts that were banned, suppressed, or simply unavailable through normal channels. Ancient philosophical works, suppressed religious documents, political treatises that challenged fundamental assumptions about government and society, all found their way into the underground chambers where they could be studied without fear of persecution. But this wasn't just passive collection. The library served as the intellectual foundation for the club's transformative work. Members didn't simply read these forbidden texts. They used them as instruction manuals for psychological and spiritual experimentation. Ancient mystery religion practices were reconstructed and adapted for 18th century use. Suppressed Christian heresies were explored not as historical curiosities, but as living alternatives to orthodox belief. The most dangerous texts dealt with political philosophy that challenged the very foundations of monarchical government. Works arguing for popular sovereignty, individual rights, and the social contract theory of governmental authority were studied intensively by men who held positions within the existing power structure. These weren't academic exercises. They were practical preparations for political changes that members could see approaching on the historical horizon. The knowledge gained through study was immediately tested through experiential practice. Philosophical concepts about human nature were explored through carefully designed rituals and interpersonal experiments. Political theories about the sources of authority were tested in the club's own internal governance structure, which operated on principles that contradicted everything members had been taught about natural hierarchy and divine appointment. The results of these experiments were recorded in documents that were kept more secret than state papers. Members maintained detailed journals describing their psychological discoveries, their insights into human nature, and their observations about the practical applications of forbidden knowledge. These records were shared among trusted associates, creating a body of knowledge about human psychology and social dynamics that was centuries ahead of academic understanding. The club's influence on medical and scientific development has been largely overlooked by historians, but it was substantial. Several members were physicians or natural philosophers who brought scientific methodology to bear on questions of human psychology and social organization. The club became an unofficial research institution where hypotheses about human nature could be tested under controlled conditions. Medical members studied the physiological effects of various substances and practices, developing understanding of how physical interventions could influence mental and emotional states. They experimented with techniques for inducing altered consciousness, managing psychological trauma, and facilitating personality change that wouldn't be rediscovered by mainstream medicine for decades. Natural philosophers used the club as a laboratory for testing theories about social organization and group dynamics. They observed how different ceremonial structures affected member behavior, how various reward and punishment systems influenced loyalty and cooperation, and how environmental factors could be manipulated to enhance psychological transformation. The data collected through these informal experiments provided insights that influenced members' approaches to everything from military organization to industrial management. Understanding how human beings actually behaved in groups, rather than how they were supposed to behave according to traditional theory, gave club members enormous advantages in their professional responsibilities. The club's approach to record keeping reveals another aspect of their sophisticated understanding of power dynamics. While they maintained detailed documentation of their experiments and discoveries, they were equally careful to control access to this information. Knowledge was compartmentalized so that no individual member, except perhaps Dashwood himself, possessed complete understanding of all club activities. This compartmentalization served multiple purposes. It provided security against betrayal by limiting how much damage any individual member could inflict if discovered or turned against the organization. It also created internal hierarchies based on access to information, giving senior members additional tools for maintaining control over newer initiates. More subtly, it ensured that the knowledge developed through club activities couldn't be easily reconstructed by outside observers. Even if substantial documentation fell into hostile hands, the compartmentalized nature of the records would make it difficult for enemies to understand the full scope of club activities or their implications for broader political and social developments. The seasonal rhythms of club activity were carefully coordinated with the natural cycles that governed agricultural and political life in 18th century England. Spring gatherings focused on renewal and new beginnings, often involving initiation ceremonies for new members or the launch of new experimental programs. These meetings took advantage of the psychological associations between seasonal change and personal transformation. Summer activities were the most elaborate and intensive, taking advantage of the long days and reduced governmental responsibilities to conduct extended experiments in community living and identity transformation. Members might spend weeks at West Wycombe, living according to principles that contradicted everything their normal lives represented, testing the psychological and practical implications of radical social reorganization. Autumn meetings focused on harvest themes, both literal and metaphorical. This was when members shared the insights gained through their experimental work. distilling practical applications from their psychological discoveries. The season's association with death and preparation for winter made it psychologically appropriate for the kind of serious reflection and strategic planning that would guide club activities through the darker months. Winter gatherings were smaller and more focused on specific projects or problems. The season's introspective quality made it ideal for deep psychological work with individual members who were struggling with particular aspects of their transformation. The long nights provided cover for extended ceremonies that might be difficult to conceal during brighter months. The club's relationship with conventional religion was far more complex than simple opposition or mockery. Many members had been genuinely devout in their youth, and their path toward religious skepticism was often painful and psychologically traumatic. The club provided support for this transition, helping members process the loss of faith while developing alternative sources of meaning and moral guidance. The mock religious ceremonies weren't just expressions of rebellion or contempt. They served as therapeutic exercises, allowing members to externalize and work through their complex feelings about the religious traditions that had shaped their early development. By deliberately inverting Christian symbolism and practice, they could explore their ambivalent relationships with beliefs they could no longer accept but couldn't simply forget. The psychological sophistication of this approach is remarkable. Rather than simply rejecting religious experience entirely, the club created alternative forms of spiritual practice that preserved the emotional and social benefits of religious participation while eliminating the intellectual constraints of orthodox belief. Members could experience transcendence, community, and moral purpose without subscribing to supernatural doctrines they found intellectually untenable. This approach had profound implications for their public religious observances. Members could participate in conventional Christian worship with apparent sincerity because they understood it as psychological theatre rather than literal truth. They could appreciate the artistic beauty, the social cohesion, and the moral insights of religious practice without being constrained by its doctrinal requirements. The club's influence on charitable and social reform activities was substantial but carefully concealed. Members understood that genuine concern for human welfare was compatible with, indeed required by, their rejection of traditional religious authority. Many became involved in progressive causes that challenged existing social arrangements while appearing to operate from conventional moral motivations. Prison reform, educational innovation, treatment of mental illness, care for the poor, all attracted club support and involvement. But this wasn't simple noblesse oblige or Christian charity. It was the practical application of insights about human nature and social organization that had been developed through club activities. Members brought to these reform efforts a sophisticated understanding of psychology and group dynamics that made their interventions far more effective than conventional charitable approaches. They understood how environmental factors influenced human behavior, how institutional structures could be modified to produce desired outcomes, and how individual psychology could be influenced through carefully designed social interventions. The results were often dramatic improvements in conditions and outcomes that seemed almost miraculous to contemporary observers. What appeared to be exceptional generosity or unusual effectiveness was actually the application of advanced knowledge about human nature that had been gained through years of careful experimentation in the club's underground chambers. The network effects created by club membership extended far beyond England's borders and continued to operate long after the organisation's formal dissolution. Members maintained correspondence with associates throughout Europe and the American colonies, sharing insights and coordinating activities in ways that influenced political and cultural developments across the Atlantic world. These networks operated according to principles of mutual support and shared interest that transcended national boundaries and political divisions. A member travelling to Paris could count on assistance from associates connected to the club's international web of relationships. Similarly, business opportunities, investment possibilities, and political intelligence flowed through these channels in ways that gave network participants enormous advantages over their competitors. The American Revolutionary period provides numerous examples of how these networks influenced historical development. Information about British governmental intentions reached colonial leaders through club connections faster and more accurately than through official diplomatic channels. Financial support for revolutionary activities came from sources that were connected to the club's international business networks. Perhaps most importantly, the political and philosophical ideas that justified American independence had been debated and refined through years of club discussions before they appeared in revolutionary documents. The concepts weren't simply borrowed from European philosophers, but had been tested and modified through practical experimentation in ways that made them more effective tools for political transformation. The French Revolutionary period shows similar patterns of club influence operating through networks that connected English members with continental associates. The radical ideas about governmental authority, individual rights, and social organization that exploded into revolutionary violence in France had been carefully developed through decades of controlled experimentation in environments like the Hellfire Club. The club's approach to financial and economic matters was equally innovative and influential. Members developed new forms of business organization, investment strategies, and commercial relationships that gave them enormous advantages in an increasingly complex global economy. The trust relationships created through shared transgression translated directly into business partnerships that could operate with unprecedented efficiency and effectiveness. The psychological bonds between members eliminated many of the transaction costs that plagued normal commercial relationships. When partners had shared experiences that created absolute mutual vulnerability, the need for elaborate legal protections and enforcement mechanisms was greatly reduced. Business could be conducted through handshake agreements that were more reliable than formal contracts between conventional associates. These advantages compounded over time as successful ventures generated resources that could be reinvested in even larger projects. The club's business networks became increasingly sophisticated and influential, eventually controlling significant portions of England's international trade and domestic development. Industries from textile manufacturing to colonial plantation agriculture bore the influence of capital and management techniques that had been developed through club connections. The environmental modifications at West Wycombe created a unique psychological landscape that reinforced and enhanced the transformative work being done through club activities. Every element of the estate's design was carefully planned to support the kind of consciousness alteration that was central to the club's mission. The approach through the estate was designed as a gradual transition from normal reality to the alternative world that existed within the club's sphere of influence. Visitors passed through a series of increasingly unusual environments that prepared them psychologically for the radical experiences awaiting them in the underground chambers. Classical statuary, mysterious grottos, carefully planned vistas, all combined to create a sense of stepping outside the normal flow of time and entering a space where different rules applied. The landscape itself became part of the club's psychological technology, using environmental cues to facilitate the kind of mental state that was necessary for successful participation in club activities. The underground chambers were the culmination of this environmental psychology. Spaces so removed from normal human experience that they naturally induced altered consciousness in anyone who entered them. The narrow passages, the flickering candlelight, the carved symbols and mysterious decorations all worked together to create an atmosphere that was simultaneously sacred and transgressive, ancient and immediate. The acoustic properties of the caves were carefully considered in their design and modification. Sound behaved differently in the underground spaces, creating echo effects and resonances that enhanced the psychological impact of ceremonies and conversations. Music, chanting, and spoken words took on otherworldly qualities that reinforced the sense of participating in something that existed outside normal reality. The temperature and air circulation in the caves created additional environmental factors that influenced consciousness and behavior. The cool, stable temperature provided relief from the seasonal variations above ground, creating a sense of timelessness that supported the psychological work being done in the chambers. The carefully engineered ventilation ensured that the air remained breathable even during large gatherings, while subtle currents carried incense and other aromatic substances throughout the complex. The integration of water elements through the artificial river Styx added another dimension to the environmental psychology. The sound of flowing water, the reflections on the cave walls, the ritual significance of crossing between different areas of the complex, all contributed to the sense of profound transformation that members experienced during their underground journeys. The club's influence on artistic and literary culture extended far beyond simple patronage or financial support. Members brought to their cultural activities the same experimental attitude and psychological sophistication that characterized their political and social work. They weren't just consuming art and literature, they were actively participating in its creation and evolution. Writers connected to the club developed new forms of satirical and philosophical expression that pushed against the boundaries of what could be safely published in 18th century England. They learned to embed radical ideas in seemingly conventional works, using allegory, symbolism, and coded language to communicate dangerous concepts to those who possess the knowledge necessary to decode their true meanings. Artists similarly developed visual languages that could convey forbidden ideas through apparently innocent imagery. Portraits, landscape paintings, and decorative objects contained references to club beliefs and experiences that were invisible to casual observers, but meaningful to those who understood the symbolic systems being employed. The club's approach to music was particularly sophisticated, recognizing sound as one of the most direct paths to altered consciousness and emotional manipulation. Members who were accomplished musicians composed works specifically for club use, creating pieces that incorporated harmonic progressions and rhythmic patterns designed to induce specific psychological states. These musical compositions weren't simply entertainment, but rather tools for consciousness alteration that were as carefully crafted as any pharmaceutical preparation. Different pieces were designed for different purposes, some to facilitate meditation and introspection, others to enhance group bonding and emotional openness, still others to induce the kind of ecstatic states that were central to the club's most profound transformational work. The influence of club-developed musical techniques extended into the broader cultural sphere through members who were involved in public musical life. Concert programs, church music, and popular entertainment all bore subtle influences from experimental work that had been done in the underground chambers, spreading club-developed consciousness alteration techniques throughout English society, without most people recognizing their true origins. The club's approach to education and child rearing represented one of their most forward-thinking innovations. Members understood that the transformation of society required not just changing existing institutions, but raising a new generation with different psychological foundations and intellectual capabilities. Rather than simply rejecting traditional educational methods, they developed alternative approaches that preserved useful elements while eliminating the authoritarian and dogmatic aspects that they saw as psychologically damaging. Children connected to club families received educations that emphasized critical thinking, psychological flexibility, and the kind of intellectual courage required to question fundamental assumptions about reality. These educational innovations weren't implemented through formal schools or public institutions, but rather through private tutoring, family instruction, and carefully selected social environments. The results were often remarkable. Young people who possessed intellectual sophistication and psychological maturity far beyond their contemporaries, who could navigate complex social situations with unusual skill and effectiveness. The long-term implications of this educational approach were staggering. The children raised according to club principles became leaders in the next generation's political, economic, and cultural development. They carried forward the insights and techniques developed by their elders, while adapting them to changing historical circumstances. The club's dissolution in the late 18th century wasn't a simple ending. but rather a transformation into new forms of organisation that were better adapted to changing political and social conditions. The networks of relationship and shared knowledge that had been created through decades of club activities continue to operate through other channels and institutions. Some members became involved in the emerging Masonic movement, bringing to it psychological techniques and organisational principles that had been developed through club experience. Others created new forms of private association that served similar functions while operating under different symbolic systems and public presentations. The influence continued through business partnerships, political alliances, and social relationships that maintained the essential characteristics of club connection: mutual vulnerability through shared transgression, psychological sophistication gained through experimental practice, and commitment to rational rather than traditional approaches to social organisation. The most profound legacy of the Hellfire Club may have been its demonstration that human nature itself was far more malleable than conventional wisdom suggested. By proving that personality, belief systems, and social relationships could be consciously modified through systematic intervention, the club opened possibilities for human development that continue to influence our understanding of psychology and social change. The techniques developed in those underground chambers anticipated discoveries in psychology, sociology, and neuroscience that wouldn't become mainstream knowledge for another 2 centuries. The recognition that consciousness could be systematically altered, that group dynamics could be consciously manipulated, that individual identity was far more flexible than previously imagined, all emerged from practical experimentation that was centuries ahead of academic theory. Today, elements of the club's approach can be recognized in fields ranging from psychotherapy to corporate training, from political organizing to personal development programs. The fundamental insights about human psychology and social dynamics that were discovered through their transgressive experiments have become part of the foundation of modern knowledge about how human beings actually function in groups and how individual consciousness can be systematically transformed. The shadows cast by those candlelit chambers continue to influence our contemporary world in ways that most people never recognize. The democratic revolutions that transformed Western civilization, the psychological techniques that shape modern therapy and education, the business practices that drive global commerce, all bear traces of insights that were first developed by men and women who were brave enough to question everything their society took for granted and sophisticated enough to develop practical alternatives to traditional ways of organizing human relationships. The Hellfire Club's ultimate achievement was proving that the most fundamental aspects of human social organization weren't natural laws, but human constructions that could be modified, improved, or completely replaced through conscious effort and systematic experimentation. This realization continues to drive social change and human development, ensuring that their influence extends far beyond the historical period in which they operated into the continuing evolution of human consciousness and social organization. The psychological architecture Dashwood had constructed was beginning to show cracks by the 1770s. What had started as controlled experimentation in human consciousness was evolving into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. The very success of the club's transformative techniques created new problems that even Dashwood's sophisticated understanding of human nature hadn't fully anticipated. Members who had undergone years of identity manipulation were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The psychological flexibility that made them so effective in their public roles also made them less predictable as club participants. Men who had learned to shift between multiple personas at will sometimes struggled to maintain consistent loyalties or commitments, even to the organization that had taught them these skills. The problem was particularly acute with newer members who had been recruited during the club's most confident and expansive period. These individuals had been introduced to advanced psychological techniques without the gradual conditioning that had prepared earlier initiates for the mental strain of sustained identity transformation. Some experienced what we might today recognize as dissociative episodes, losing track of which version of themselves was authentic and which were merely masks adopted for strategic purposes. Dashwood found himself in the unprecedented position of having to manage not just the external security of his organization, but the internal psychological stability of its members. He began developing new techniques for helping individuals integrate their various personas into coherent wholes, drawing on ancient therapeutic traditions that he discovered in the club's extensive library of forbidden texts. These therapeutic interventions required even greater secrecy than the club's regular activities. Members who were struggling with identity confusion couldn't be allowed to participate in normal club functions until they had regained psychological equilibrium. Special chambers were prepared deep within the cave system, where intensive individual work could be conducted without disrupting the organization's other activities. The women associated with the club proved invaluable during this crisis. Their experience with character development and emotional authenticity made them natural therapists for men who were struggling to reconcile their various identities. They developed techniques for helping members access and integrate suppressed memories, process traumatic experiences, and rebuild coherent sense of self from the fragments of their experimental personas. This therapeutic work revealed aspects of human psychology that wouldn't be understood by mainstream medicine for decades. The club's practitioners discovered that memory itself was far more malleable than anyone had previously imagined, that traumatic experiences could be processed and integrated through carefully designed ritual interventions, and that personality disorders could often be resolved through systematic exposure to controlled psychological stress. The knowledge gained through these therapeutic experiments had immediate practical applications. Members learned to recognize the early warning signs of psychological breakdown in themselves and others, giving them significant advantages in political and business situations where they might encounter individuals under severe mental strain. They developed techniques for deliberately inducing psychological instability in opponents while maintaining their own equilibrium under pressure. More importantly, they began to understand how their experimental techniques could be applied to broader social problems. The psychological methods that worked for helping individual members integrate fragmented identities could be scaled up to help communities process collective trauma or navigate periods of rapid social change. The therapeutic insights gained through club work informed members' approaches to everything from military leadership to urban planning. The club's international network proved crucial during this period of internal crisis. Associates in other countries had been developing parallel techniques for consciousness alteration and identity manipulation, often working from the same ancient sources that informed the English experiments. Cross-cultural exchange of therapeutic knowledge helped club practitioners develop more sophisticated approaches to the psychological problems they were encountering. French associates, influenced by the emerging Enlightenment emphasis on rational analysis, contributed systematic methods for documenting and analyzing psychological phenomena. German contacts, drawing on mystical traditions that had survived from medieval times, provided techniques for accessing and working with unconscious mental processes. Colonial American members, dealing with the psychological stress of living between two cultures, developed practical approaches to identity flexibility that proved invaluable for the English experiments. This international collaboration created a body of psychological knowledge that was centuries ahead of academic understanding. The club's practitioners were effectively conducting advanced research in fields that wouldn't be formally recognized until the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Their insights into consciousness alteration, group dynamics, and therapeutic intervention provided foundations for developments in psychology, psychiatry, and social work that are still influential today. The business applications of these psychological discoveries were immediately apparent to club members who were involved in commercial activities. Understanding how to recognize and manage psychological instability gave them enormous advantages in negotiations, partnerships, and employee management. They could identify individuals who were vulnerable to manipulation while protecting themselves from similar exploitation by others. The club's approach to financial investment became increasingly sophisticated as members learned to apply psychological analysis to market behavior. They understood that economic decisions were driven more by emotion and unconscious motivation than by rational calculation, giving them the ability to predict and profit from market movements that baffled their contemporaries. Industrial members used psychological insights to develop more effective management techniques for their manufacturing operations. They learned how environmental factors influenced worker productivity, how group dynamics affected manufacturing quality, and how individual psychology could be managed to reduce conflicts and increase cooperation. The results were often dramatic improvements in efficiency and profitability that seemed almost miraculous to outside observers. Agricultural members applied similar techniques to rural estate management, discovering how psychological factors influenced everything from tenant-farmer productivity to livestock behavior. They developed methods for creating social environments that encouraged innovation and cooperation, while discouraging the kind of rural unrest that was becoming increasingly common throughout England. The club's influence on military affairs during this period was substantial but carefully concealed. Several members held positions in the army or navy that gave them opportunities to test psychological insights in military contexts. They experimented with techniques for maintaining morale during extended campaigns, managing the psychological stress of combat, and developing the kind of unit cohesion that was essential for battlefield effectiveness. These military applications proved particularly valuable during the American colonial conflicts that were escalating throughout the 1770s. British forces found themselves fighting an unconventional war against opponents who understood how to use psychological warfare techniques that the regular army had never encountered. Club members who understood these methods could develop counter-strategies that gave British forces significant advantages in specific engagements. The intelligence gathered through these military experiments informed broader strategic thinking about how to manage colonial resistance. Club members understood that the American Rebellion wasn't just a political disagreement, but a psychological phenomenon that required different approaches from conventional military or diplomatic responses. Their insights influenced policy decisions at the highest levels of government, though their contributions were never publicly acknowledged. The club's approach to managing information and controlling public opinion became increasingly sophisticated during this period of political crisis. Members understood that public perception was more important than objective reality in determining political outcomes, giving them tools for manipulating social and political developments that their opponents couldn't match. They developed techniques for seeding ideas into public discourse through carefully orchestrated campaigns that appeared to emerge spontaneously from popular sentiment. Newspaper articles, pamphlets, public speeches, and private conversations were coordinated to create the impression of widespread support for positions that actually originated in the club's underground chambers. The psychological sophistication of these information campaigns was remarkable. Rather than simply promoting particular policies or candidates, club members learned to shape the emotional and psychological context within which political decisions were made. They could make certain ideas seem inevitable, certain leaders appear charismatic, certain policies feel urgently necessary, all through carefully designed interventions in the public information environment. The success of these techniques created new opportunities, but also new vulnerabilities. As club members became more skilled at manipulating public opinion, they also became more dependent on these manipulations for maintaining their political positions. The gap between their public personas and their private beliefs grew wider, requiring increasingly elaborate deceptions to maintain their credibility with constituents who had no idea of their true motivations and methods. The strain of maintaining these multiple deceptions began to affect even the most psychologically sophisticated club members. The constant shifting between public and private identities combined with the ongoing stress of managing the club's internal psychological crisis, created levels of mental fatigue that threatened the organisation's long-term viability. Dashwood recognised that the club had reached a critical juncture in its development. The techniques that had made it so successful were also making it increasingly unstable and difficult to manage. The psychological sophistication of its members had advanced to the point where they were becoming unpredictable even to each other, creating internal conflicts that threatened to destroy the organisation from within. The solution he developed was characteristically innovative and psychologically sophisticated. Rather than attempting to maintain direct control over increasingly autonomous members, he began to restructure the club around principles of controlled chaos and managed unpredictability. Instead of trying to prevent the psychological instability that advanced consciousness alterations seem to create, he learned to harness it as a source of creative energy and adaptive capability. New ceremonial structures were developed that incorporated deliberate elements of uncertainty and surprise. Members never knew exactly what to expect from club gatherings, keeping them psychologically engaged while preventing the kind of routine that might lead to boredom or complacency. The unpredictability became part of the club's transformative power, forcing participants to remain mentally flexible and emotionally responsive. This approach required fundamental changes in how club activities were planned and conducted. Rather than following predetermined scripts, ceremonies became improvisational performances where members had to respond spontaneously to unexpected developments. The psychological stress created by these situations was carefully managed to remain within therapeutic rather than traumatic ranges, but it was sufficient to prevent the kind of psychological stagnation that had been threatening the organisation. The results exceeded even Dashwood's optimistic expectations. Members who had been struggling with identity integration found that the new ceremonial approach helped them develop more flexible and resilient psychological structures. Instead of trying to maintain rigid separation between their various personas, they learned to flow smoothly between different identity states as circumstances required. The enhanced psychological flexibility created by these new techniques had immediate practical applications in members' public lives. They became even more effective politicians, negotiators, and business leaders because they could adapt their approaches in real time based on the psychological dynamics they encountered in different situations. Their ability to read and respond to other people's emotional and psychological states became almost supernatural in its accuracy and effectiveness. The club's influence on artistic and cultural development accelerated during this period of internal transformation. Members who were experiencing enhanced psychological flexibility brought new creative energies to their cultural activities, producing works that pushed artistic boundaries while remaining commercially and socially acceptable to mainstream audiences. Writers associated with the club developed new forms of literary expression that incorporated the psychological insights gained through their experimental work. They learned to create characters who possessed the kind of psychological complexity and moral ambiguity that reflected their own experiences with identity transformation. These literary innovations influenced the development of the novel as an art form, contributing to the emergence of psychological realism that would become central to modern literature. Artists similarly incorporated their psychological discoveries into visual works that operated on multiple levels of meaning and interpretation. Paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects contained layers of symbolism that could be read differently depending on the viewer's level of psychological sophistication and symbolic knowledge. These works served as communication devices within the club's network, while appearing as conventional artistic productions to outside observers. Architectural members brought psychological insights to bear on building design and urban planning projects that influenced the development of entire communities. They understood how physical environments affected human psychology and behavior, giving them tools for creating spaces that encourage specific types of social interaction and individual development. The gardens and landscape designs created by club members became laboratories for testing theories about the relationship between natural environments and human consciousness. They developed techniques for using plants, water features, pathways, and sightlines to create psychological experiences that could influence visitors' emotional and mental states in subtle but profound ways. These environmental psychology experiments had practical applications that extended far beyond aesthetic considerations. Club members learned to design spaces that enhanced their own psychological work, while concealing it from outside observers. Private homes, public buildings, and commercial establishments all incorporated elements that served the club's purposes while appearing to casual visitors as merely elegant or innovative design choices. The club's approach to economic development became increasingly sophisticated as members learned to apply psychological insights to large-scale commercial and industrial projects. They understood that economic activity was fundamentally a social phenomenon driven by human psychology rather than abstract market forces, giving them tools for predicting and influencing economic trends that their contemporaries found mysterious. Banking members developed new approaches to credit evaluation and risk assessment that incorporated psychological analysis of borrowers and business partners. They could identify individuals who were likely to succeed or fail in business ventures based on personality characteristics and psychological patterns that conventional financial analysis couldn't detect. Manufacturing members applied psychological insights to product development and marketing strategies that anticipated consumer desires and preferences with unprecedented accuracy. They learned to create products that satisfied psychological needs that customers themselves might not consciously recognize, leading to commercial successes that seemed almost magical to competitors who didn't understand the psychological principles involved. Agricultural and colonial members used similar techniques to develop more effective approaches to land development and resource extraction. They understood how to create social and economic structures that encourage productivity while maintaining the kind of social stability that was essential for long-term profitability. The club's influence on religious and philosophical development during this period was profound, but carefully concealed. Members were developing alternative approaches to spiritual and moral questions that challenged fundamental assumptions of Christian doctrine while remaining acceptable to public audiences who weren't prepared for radical departures from traditional belief systems. Rather than simply rejecting religious experience, club members were creating new forms of spiritual practice that incorporated insights from multiple traditions, while avoiding the dogmatic constraints that they found intellectually unacceptable. These synthetic approaches drew on Christian mysticism, classical philosophy, ancient mystery religions, and emerging scientific understanding to create coherent worldviews that satisfied both intellectual and emotional needs. The psychological sophistication required to navigate between these different belief systems created individuals who possessed unusual wisdom and moral flexibility. Club members could find common ground with people from diverse religious and philosophical backgrounds because they understood the psychological functions that different belief systems served rather than being limited by their specific doctrinal content. This religious and philosophical sophistication had immediate practical applications in political and diplomatic contexts, where members had to work with individuals from different cultural and religious traditions. Their ability to understand and communicate with people whose fundamental beliefs differed from their own gave them enormous advantages in negotiations and relationship building. The club's therapeutic innovations during this period anticipated developments in psychology and psychiatry that wouldn't become mainstream for another century. Members were effectively conducting advanced research in fields that wouldn't be formally recognized until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, developing techniques for treating psychological disorders and facilitating personal transformation that were far ahead of contemporary medical understanding. The integration of physical and psychological approaches to healing was particularly innovative. Club practitioners understood that mental and emotional problems often had physical components that had to be addressed through bodily interventions, rather than purely intellectual or spiritual methods. They developed techniques combining massage, controlled breathing, dietary modification, and exercise with psychological counseling and ritual intervention. These holistic therapeutic approaches proved remarkably effective for treating conditions that conventional medicine of the period couldn't address. Members who were struggling with what we might today recognize as depression, anxiety, trauma-related disorders, or identity confusion found relief through club-developed treatment programs that addressed their problems from multiple angles simultaneously. The knowledge gained through these therapeutic experiments informed members' approaches to managing their own psychological health and that of their families and associates. They developed preventive techniques for maintaining mental and emotional equilibrium under stress, early intervention strategies for addressing psychological problems before they became severe, and crisis management approaches for dealing with acute psychological emergencies. The club's influence on child development and education continued to evolve during this period of internal transformation. Members were applying their enhanced understanding of psychology and human development to create educational environments that fostered the kind of intellectual flexibility and emotional resilience that would be necessary for success in an increasingly complex world. Rather than simply transmitting traditional knowledge and values, club-influenced educational programs focused on developing critical thinking skills, psychological self-awareness, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Students learned to question assumptions, analyze complex problems from multiple perspectives, and maintain emotional equilibrium under pressure. These educational innovations produced young adults who possessed intellectual sophistication and psychological maturity far beyond their contemporaries. They were better prepared for leadership roles in politics, business, and cultural development because they had been trained from childhood to think systematically about human psychology and social dynamics. The long-term implications of these educational approaches were staggering. The children raised according to club principles became leaders in the next generation's development, carrying forward insights and techniques that had been developed through decades of experimental work, while adapting them to new historical circumstances and challenges. The club's network effects continued to expand during this period, creating webs of relationship and influence that extended throughout English society and beyond into the international arena. Members maintained connections with associates across Europe and the American colonies, sharing insights and coordinating activities in ways that influenced political and cultural developments across the Atlantic world. These networks operated according to principles of mutual support and shared interest that transcended national boundaries, political divisions, and religious differences. Associates could count on assistance from network participants regardless of their official affiliations or public positions, creating informal systems of cooperation that were often more effective than formal diplomatic or commercial relationships. The intelligence gathered through these international networks gave club members access to information about foreign political developments, economic opportunities, and cultural innovations that wasn't available through official channels. This intelligence advantage translated into significant benefits in business negotiations, investment decisions, and political maneuvering. The club's influence on the emerging industrial revolution was substantial, but largely unrecognized by contemporary observers. Members who were involved in manufacturing and technology development brought psychological insights to bear on problems of industrial organization, worker management, and technological innovation that gave them significant advantages over competitors who relied on traditional approaches. They understood that technological change wasn't just a matter of engineering and economics, but involved complex psychological and social factors that had to be carefully managed to ensure successful implementation. Their ability to anticipate and address the human factors involved in industrial development made them pioneers in fields that wouldn't be formally recognized for decades. Manufacturing members developed techniques for organizing production processes that took into account worker psychology, group dynamics, and the social implications of technological change. They created work environments that encouraged innovation and productivity while maintaining the kind of social stability that was necessary for long-term success. The results were often dramatic improvements in efficiency and profitability that seemed almost miraculous to outside observers. What appeared to be exceptional business acumen or unusual good fortune was actually the application of sophisticated psychological knowledge that had been developed through years of experimental work in very different contexts. The club's approach to managing social change during this period of rapid historical transformation was characteristically sophisticated and far-sighted. Members understood that the political and economic upheavals that were reshaping the Western world represented opportunities for those who could anticipate and adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining psychological equilibrium under pressure. Rather than simply reacting to historical events, club members learned to identify underlying trends and patterns that would shape future developments. Their psychological sophistication gave them tools for understanding how human beings respond to stress, uncertainty, and opportunity, allowing them to predict social and political changes that caught their contemporaries by surprise. This predictive capability translated into enormous practical advantages in investment decisions, political positioning, and strategic planning. Club members could position themselves to benefit from changes that destroyed less prepared individuals and organizations, while avoiding the pitfalls that trapped those who couldn't adapt to new circumstances. The American colonial crisis provided a perfect example of how club insights could be applied to major historical developments. Members understood that the conflict represented more than a simple political disagreement about taxation and representation. It was a fundamental challenge to traditional assumptions about authority, legitimacy, and the relationship between individuals and government. Club members who had spent years experimenting with alternative forms of social organization understood the psychological and philosophical foundations of colonial resistance in ways that conventional political analysis couldn't match. They could predict how the conflict would develop, which strategies would be effective for both sides, and what the long-term implications would be for political development throughout the Western world. This understanding informed their approaches to the crisis, whether they supported British attempts to maintain imperial control or sympathized with colonial desires for independence. In either case, their psychological sophistication gave them tools for navigating the complex political and social dynamics involved in the conflict. The club's influence on the developing crisis extended far beyond individual member contributions. The networks of relationship and communication that had been built through decades of club activities created channels for information exchange and coordination that operated outside normal political and diplomatic processes. Colonial associates who were connected to the club's international network had access to intelligence about British governmental intentions that wasn't available through official sources. Similarly, British members could obtain information about colonial activities and attitudes that formal intelligence networks couldn't provide. This informal intelligence network influenced decision-making on both sides of the Atlantic in ways that shaped the development and outcome of the conflict. Strategic decisions, diplomatic initiatives, and military operations were all affected by information that flowed through club-connected channels, though the extent of this influence was never publicly acknowledged. The psychological techniques developed through club activities proved particularly valuable for managing the stresses and uncertainties of the revolutionary period. Members who had learned to maintain psychological equilibrium under pressure could function effectively during crises that overwhelmed less prepared individuals. Their ability to shift between different identity states allowed them to navigate complex political situations where conflicting loyalties and changing circumstances required rapid adaptation. They could maintain productive relationships with individuals on different sides of political disputes because they understood how to compartmentalize their various roles and commitments. The club's therapeutic innovations proved invaluable for helping individuals process the psychological trauma associated with political upheaval and social change. Techniques that had been developed for helping members integrate fragmented identities could be applied to broader problems of social and cultural adaptation during periods of rapid historical transformation. The long-term implications of the club's influence on the American Revolutionary period extended far beyond the immediate political outcomes. The psychological and philosophical insights that informed colonial resistance to British authority became foundational elements in the development of democratic political theory and practice. Concepts about individual rights, governmental legitimacy, and the social contract that appeared in revolutionary documents had been debated and refined through years of club discussions before they became part of formal political philosophy. The practical experience gained through experimental work with alternative forms of social organization informed the constitutional innovations that emerged from the revolutionary period. The club's influence on French political development during the same period shows similar patterns of underground preparation for public transformation. Members who traveled to France maintained connections with associates who were developing parallel critiques of traditional authority and experimenting with alternative approaches to social organization. The philosophical and psychological foundations of French revolutionary thought owed much to ideas that had been tested and refined through club-connected networks throughout Europe. The radical concepts about human nature, social organization, and political legitimacy that exploded into revolutionary violence had been carefully developed through decades of controlled experimentation in environments like the Hellfire Club. The club's therapeutic and educational innovations proved particularly influential in French contexts, where traditional social structures were breaking down more rapidly and completely than in England. Techniques for managing psychological stress, facilitating identity transformation, and creating new forms of social solidarity became essential tools for navigating the chaos of revolutionary change. The international networks that had been built through club activities provided crucial support for individuals who were attempting to create new forms of political and social organization during the French Revolutionary period. Intelligence, financial resources, and practical expertise flowed through these channels in ways that influenced the development and outcome of revolutionary events. The club's influence on economic development during this period of political upheaval was equally significant. Members understood that economic relationships were fundamentally social and psychological phenomena that could be consciously shaped through systematic intervention. The financial innovations that emerged during the late 18th century owed much to insights that had been developed through club-connected networks. New approaches to banking, investment, and commercial organization incorporated psychological understanding that gave them advantages over traditional business methods. The industrial development that was transforming English society during this period was similarly influenced by club insights into human psychology and social organization. Members who were involved in manufacturing and technology development could anticipate and manage the social implications of industrial change in ways that their competitors couldn't match. The club's dissolution in the late 18th century represented not an ending, but a transformation into new forms of organization that were better adapted to changing historical circumstances. The networks of relationship and shared knowledge that had been created through decades of club activities continue to operate through other channels and institutions. The psychological techniques, philosophical insights, and practical knowledge that had been developed through club activities became part of the intellectual and cultural foundation for the modern Western world. Democratic political theory, industrial capitalism, modern psychology, and contemporary approaches to education and social organization all bear traces of innovations that were first developed in the underground chambers of West Wycombe. The club's ultimate legacy lies not in any specific historical achievements, but in its demonstration that human consciousness itself could be systematically transformed through conscious effort and systematic experimentation. This realization continues to influence human development and social change, ensuring that the insights gained through their transgressive experiments remain relevant to contemporary challenges and opportunities. The shadows cast by those candlelit chambers extend into our modern world in ways that most people never recognize, reminding us that the most profound changes in human history often begin not in public institutions, but in private gatherings of individuals who are willing to question everything their society takes for granted and brave enough to act on the insights that emerge from such questioning. The techniques for consciousness alteration, the understanding of group dynamics, the recognition of human psychological flexibility, all emerged from practical experimentation that was centuries ahead of academic theory. Today, These insights form part of the foundation of modern knowledge about human psychology and social organization. Though their origins in the transgressive experiments of 18th century English aristocrats remain largely forgotten, the network's reach extended beyond anything contemporary observers could have imagined. By the 1780s, what had begun as a singular English experiment had spawned imitators and offshoots across 3 continents. The psychological technologies developed in those chalk caves were being refined and adapted in drawing rooms from Edinburgh to Philadelphia, from Dublin to the colonial plantations of the Caribbean. But here's where the story becomes truly fascinating. The club's influence wasn't spreading through direct recruitment or formal expansion. Instead, it was propagating through something far more subtle and powerful. The transformed individuals who had passed through Dashwood's chambers were carrying within them new ways of thinking and being that infected every organization they touched. Consider what happened when a club member returned to his regiment. He didn't announce his affiliations or attempt to convert his fellow officers to any particular doctrine. Instead, he simply applied the psychological insights he'd gained through years of underground experimentation. He understood how to read the hidden motivations driving military hierarchy. He knew which officers were vulnerable to manipulation and which could be trusted with sensitive responsibilities. Most importantly, he possessed techniques for maintaining psychological equilibrium under the extreme stress of combat that made him extraordinarily effective as a leader. The results spoke for themselves. Units commanded by club-influenced officers consistently outperformed their peers, not through superior tactics or equipment, but through psychological advantages that their enemies couldn't understand or counter. These officers knew how to maintain morale during desperate situations, how to exploit psychological weaknesses in opposing forces, and how to create the kind of unit cohesion that transformed ordinary soldiers into elite fighting forces. Similar patterns emerged wherever club members applied their enhanced psychological capabilities. Parliamentary debates were subtly influenced by individuals who understood how to manipulate emotional dynamics in large groups. Commercial negotiations were dominated by participants who could read unconscious motivations and respond to psychological needs that their counterparts didn't even recognize they possessed. The transformation was so gradual and comprehensive that most people never realized what was happening. English society was being rewired from within by individuals who had learned to see through conventional appearances to the psychological mechanisms that actually drove human behavior. The changes weren't dramatic or sudden, but they were profound and irreversible. The club's approach to information warfare reached new levels of sophistication during this period. Members understood that controlling public opinion required more than simply publishing favorable articles or suppressing unfavorable ones. True influence came from shaping the psychological context within which people processed information, making certain ideas seem natural and inevitable while rendering others literally unthinkable. They developed techniques for seeding concepts into public discourse that would germinate slowly over months or years before blooming into widespread social movements. A carefully placed conversation at a dinner party might plant an idea that would spread through social networks, gaining credibility through repetition until it appeared to emerge spontaneously from popular wisdom. The genius of this approach lay in its invisibility. People believed they were developing their own opinions based on their personal observations and experiences. They had no idea that their thought processes were being guided by individuals who understood how human psychology actually functioned beneath the surface of conscious awareness. The American colonial situation provided the perfect laboratory for testing these advanced information warfare techniques. Club members on both sides of the Atlantic coordinated their efforts to shape public perception of the growing conflict in ways that served their broader objectives, regardless of which side ultimately prevailed. British members planted stories that portrayed colonial resistance as the work of dangerous radicals who threatened the stability of civilized society. colonial associates countered with narratives that framed British policies as tyrannical overreach that violated fundamental principles of human dignity. Both sides used psychological manipulation techniques to make their preferred interpretations seem obviously correct to their respective audiences. But here's the truly remarkable aspect of this campaign. Many of the same individuals were simultaneously supporting both narratives, depending on their audience and objectives. Club members understood that the actual outcome of the political conflict was less important than ensuring that the eventual resolution would create opportunities for those who possess superior psychological understanding and social manipulation skills. They were playing a game that their contemporaries couldn't even perceive, much less participate in effectively. While conventional politicians and military leaders focused on immediate tactical advantages, club members were positioning themselves to benefit from long-term historical trends that they could predict because they understood the psychological forces driving social change. The religious implications of club activities during this period were particularly complex and far-reaching. Members weren't simply rejecting Christian doctrine or embracing alternative belief systems. They were developing sophisticated understanding of how religious experience actually functioned in human psychology and social organization. They recognized that spiritual practices served crucial psychological functions that couldn't be eliminated without creating dangerous mental and social instabilities. People needed transcendent experiences, moral frameworks, and community rituals that connected them to something larger than their immediate personal concerns. The challenge was providing these psychological necessities without the intellectual constraints and social control mechanisms that traditional religions imposed. The solution they developed was characteristically elegant and subversive. Rather than attacking religious institutions directly, they learned to work within existing structures while gradually transforming their psychological and social functions. A club member serving as a church official could maintain all the outward forms of Orthodox Christianity while subtly shifting the emotional and intellectual content of religious experience. Sermons that appeared conventionally pious to casual listeners contained carefully embedded messages that encouraged independent thinking and psychological flexibility among those who possessed the knowledge necessary to decode their true meanings. Ritual practices were modified in ways that enhanced their psychological effectiveness while reducing their capacity for social control. Educational programs were restructured to develop critical thinking skills under the guise of deeper religious instruction. The cumulative effect of these interventions was profound. Religious institutions that had served for centuries as mechanisms of social control were gradually transformed into vehicles for psychological liberation and intellectual development. The process was so gradual that most participants never realized what was happening, but the results were revolutionary. Young people raised in club-influenced religious environments developed psychological resilience and intellectual sophistication that made them natural leaders in whatever fields they eventually entered. They possessed deep spiritual sensitivity combined with rational analytical capabilities that allowed them to navigate complex moral and practical problems with unusual wisdom and effectiveness. The educational innovations that emerged from club influence during this period anticipated developments in pedagogy and child psychology that wouldn't become mainstream for another century. Members understood that effective learning required more than simply transmitting information from teacher to student. It demanded creating psychological and social environments that encouraged natural curiosity while developing the cognitive and emotional capabilities necessary for independent thinking. Traditional educational approaches that relied on rote memorization and authoritarian discipline were gradually replaced by methods that engaged students' natural learning instincts while building psychological resilience and social competence. Children learn through exploration and experimentation, rather than passive absorption of predetermined content. The results were often dramatic. Students educated according to club influence principles consistently outperformed their peers in intellectual achievement while displaying superior emotional maturity and social skills. They became natural leaders who possessed the psychological flexibility necessary to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining ethical principles and personal integrity. These educational advantages compounded over time as club-influenced individuals rose to positions of authority in various fields. They created work environments, social institutions, and cultural practices that reflected their enhanced understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. The influence spread through society like ripples from stones dropped in still water, transforming everything they touched. The club's approach to managing economic relationships during this period of rapid commercial development was similarly innovative and influential. Members understood that business success required more than technical competence or access to capital. It demanded sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics that most commercial practitioners lacked. They developed techniques for evaluating potential partners, employees, and customers that went far beyond conventional financial analysis. They could identify individuals who possessed hidden talents or psychological characteristics that made them valuable associates, while avoiding those whose personality patterns indicated likely problems regardless of their apparent qualifications. The psychological insights gained through club activities proved particularly valuable in international commerce, where cultural differences created communication challenges that could destroy even promising business relationships. Club members who understood how different societies structured psychological and social relationships could navigate these complexities with unusual success. They learned to recognize universal human psychological patterns beneath surface cultural variations, allowing them to build trust and cooperation with individuals from very different backgrounds. Their ability to adapt their communication and negotiation styles to match their partner's psychological needs made them extraordinarily effective in cross-cultural business situations. The financial innovations that emerged from club networks during this period laid important groundwork for the development of modern capitalism. Members developed new approaches to credit evaluation, risk assessment, and investment strategy that incorporated psychological analysis alongside traditional financial metrics. They understood that economic decisions were driven more by emotional and unconscious factors than by rational calculation, giving them tools for predicting market behavior that their contemporaries found mysterious. Their ability to anticipate psychological responses to economic events allowed them to position themselves advantageously before major market movements became apparent to conventional analysts. The industrial applications of club-developed psychological insights were equally revolutionary. Members involved in manufacturing learned to create work environments that maximize productivity while maintaining worker satisfaction and social stability. They understood how physical surroundings, social relationships, and management practices affected human psychology and performance. The factories and workshops designed according to club principles consistently outperformed their competitors while maintaining better relationships between management and workers. These advantages weren't achieved through higher wages or better benefits, but through sophisticated understanding of how human beings actually functioned in group work situations. The agricultural innovations that emerged from club influence were similarly advanced for their time. Members who managed rural estates learned to apply psychological insights to relationships with tenant farmers, seasonal workers, and local communities. They developed approaches to land management that enhanced productivity while building social cooperation, rather than creating the conflicts that plagued many agricultural regions. These innovations had implications that extended far beyond individual estate management. Club members were effectively developing new models for rural social organization that could address the economic and social challenges created by agricultural modernization and population growth. The club's influence on legal and judicial development during this period was substantial but carefully concealed. Members who held positions in the legal system understood that law was fundamentally a psychological and social phenomenon, rather than a purely logical or technical discipline. They developed approaches to legal practice that incorporated sophisticated understanding of human psychology and group dynamics. They could predict how juries would respond to different arguments and evidence presentations, giving them enormous advantages in courtroom situations. More importantly, they understood how legal institutions actually function to maintain social order and individual behavior. This understanding informed their approaches to legal reform and institutional development. Rather than simply advocating for specific policy changes, they worked to modify the psychological and social mechanisms through which legal systems influenced human behavior. The results were often subtle, but profound changes in how justice was administered and how legal institutions served broader social functions. The club's therapeutic innovations during this period continued to anticipate developments in psychology and psychiatry that wouldn't become mainstream for decades. Members were developing systematic approaches to mental and emotional healing that addressed problems conventional medicine couldn't even recognize, much less treat effectively. They understood that psychological disorders often resulted from conflicts between different aspects of personality that had been artificially separated through social conditioning and traumatic experiences. Their therapeutic techniques focused on helping individuals integrate these fragmented aspects into coherent wholes that could function effectively under stress. The integration work required sophisticated understanding of memory, emotion, and consciousness that wouldn't be formally recognized by academic psychology for another century. Club practitioners were effectively conducting advanced research in fields that hadn't yet been invented, developing practical techniques for consciousness modification and personality integration that proved remarkably effective. These therapeutic capabilities had immediate practical applications beyond treating individual psychological problems. Club members learned to recognize and address the psychological factors that contributed to social conflicts, political instability, and economic disruption. Their ability to understand and modify group psychology made them extraordinarily effective at managing complex social situations. The international networks that had developed through club activities continued to expand and evolve during this period of global political upheaval. Associates in different countries were facing similar challenges as traditional social and political structures came under increasing pressure from economic change and intellectual development. The psychological insights and practical techniques that had been developed through English experiments proved valuable for addressing problems throughout the Atlantic world. Colonial associates, dealing with the complexities of independence movements, could apply club-developed understanding of group dynamics and social change management to their specific situations. European associates navigating the intellectual and political ferment of the Enlightenment found that club techniques for managing psychological transformation and social adaptation gave them tools for participating effectively in the broader cultural revolution that was reshaping Western civilization. The cross-cultural exchange of knowledge and techniques through club networks accelerated innovation in psychology, politics, and social organization. Ideas that emerged from specific local experiments were tested and refined through application in different cultural contexts, creating a body of practical knowledge about human nature and social dynamics that was unprecedented in its scope and sophistication. The revolutionary upheavals of the late 18th century provided the ultimate test of club-developed theories and techniques. Members found themselves in positions of leadership during some of the most dramatic social and political transformations in human history, with opportunities to apply their psychological insights on unprecedented scales. The American Revolutionary period demonstrated the practical effectiveness of club-developed approaches to political organization and social change management. Associates who understood how to build consensus, maintain morale during crises, and create institutional structures that balanced competing interests played crucial roles in the successful establishment of independent American government. The French Revolutionary period provided even more dramatic opportunities for applying club insights to large-scale social transformation. Associates who understood the psychological dynamics of revolutionary change could anticipate developments that caught conventional political analysts by surprise. positioning themselves to influence outcomes while avoiding the dangers that destroyed less prepared individuals. The Industrial Revolution, that was simultaneously transforming economic and social relationships throughout the Western world, created additional opportunities for club members to apply their enhanced understanding of human psychology and social organization. They could anticipate the social implications of technological change and develop strategies for managing the transitions more effectively than those who focused only on technical and economic factors. The cumulative effect of these applications was a fundamental transformation in how human societies organized themselves and how individuals understood their relationships to social and political institutions. The psychological insights that had been developed through club experiments became part of the intellectual foundation for modern democratic government, industrial capitalism, and scientific approaches to human development. The club's influence on artistic and cultural development during this period of historical transformation was equally profound. Members who possessed enhanced psychological understanding brought new depth and sophistication to creative work that influenced the development of literature, visual arts, and musical expression. Writers associated with club networks developed new forms of literary expression that incorporated insights about human psychology and social dynamics that hadn't been available to earlier generations. They could create characters with psychological complexity that reflected their understanding of how personality actually functioned beneath surface appearances. The novels, plays, and poetry that emerged from club influence helped establish new standards for artistic authenticity and psychological realism that would influence cultural development for generations. These works didn't simply entertain audiences, but educated them about aspects of human nature and social relationships that conventional education ignored. Visual artists similarly incorporated psychological insights into works that operated on multiple levels of meaning and interpretation. Paintings, sculptures, and architectural projects contained symbolic elements that communicated sophisticated ideas about consciousness, identity, and social organization to viewers who possessed the knowledge necessary to decode their messages. The musical innovations that emerged from club influence were particularly remarkable. Members who understood how sound affected human psychology developed compositional techniques that could induce specific emotional and mental states in listeners. These weren't simply entertainment, but tools for consciousness alteration that could facilitate psychological transformation and spiritual development. The cultural products created through club influence served multiple functions simultaneously. They provided aesthetic pleasure and intellectual stimulation for general audiences while communicating advanced psychological and social insights to those who possessed specialized knowledge. This dual-level communication system allowed dangerous ideas to circulate safely within mainstream cultural contexts. The long-term implications of club influence on cultural development extended far beyond the immediate historical period. The artistic innovations and cultural practices that emerged from their work became part of the foundation for modern approaches to creative expression and cultural communication. The club's approach to managing secrecy and information security during this period of expansion and application was remarkably sophisticated. As their influence spread and their techniques were applied in increasingly diverse contexts, the challenge of maintaining operational security became more complex and critical. They developed compartmentalized communication systems that allowed coordination of activities across broad networks while limiting individual members' knowledge to what they needed for their specific responsibilities. This approach provided security against betrayal or discovery, while maintaining the flexibility necessary for effective action in rapidly changing situations. The psychological techniques that had been developed for internal club use proved equally valuable for managing external security threats. Members learned to recognize individuals who pose potential risks to their operations, while identifying those who could be safely brought into their sphere of influence. They developed sophisticated approaches to disinformation and misdirection that could conceal their true activities while creating false impressions about their objectives and capabilities. The same psychological insights that made them effective at personal influence and social manipulation served to protect their networks from hostile investigation and interference. The security measures weren't simply defensive, but actively contributed to the effectiveness of club operations. The mystery and speculation that surrounded their activities created psychological effects that enhanced their influence while discouraging detailed investigation by potentially hostile authorities. The club's ultimate transformation during the late 18th century reflected their understanding that successful adaptation required continuous evolution rather than rigid adherence to established patterns. As historical circumstances changed, their organizational structures and operational methods evolved to remain effective under new conditions. The formal dissolution of the original club structure didn't represent failure, but rather successful metamorphosis into forms better suited to the emerging modern world. The networks of relationship and shared knowledge that had been created through decades of experimental work continue to operate through other channels and institutions. The psychological techniques, philosophical insights, and practical knowledge that had been developed through club activities became part of the intellectual and cultural DNA of Western civilization. Democratic political theory, modern psychology, industrial organization, and contemporary approaches to education and human development all incorporated elements that had been first explored in those underground chambers. The influence continues to operate in ways that most people never recognize, woven so deeply into the fabric of modern society that it appears natural and inevitable rather than the product of conscious innovation and systematic experimentation. The shadows cast by those candlelit ceremonies extend into our contemporary world, shaping how we understand human nature, social organization, and the possibilities for conscious transformation of individual and collective life. The club's greatest achievement may have been proving that human consciousness itself could be systematically modified through conscious effort and scientific experimentation. This demonstration opened possibilities for human development and social change that continue to influence our understanding of what it means to be human and how we can consciously participate in our own evolution and that of our societies. The techniques they developed for consciousness alteration, identity transformation, and social influence remain relevant to contemporary challenges and opportunities. Though the specific forms have evolved, the underlying principles continue to guide individuals and organizations, seeking to create positive change in themselves and their communities. The story of the Hellfire Club ultimately reveals something profound about human potential and the possibilities for conscious evolution. Those men and women who gathered in underground chambers weren't just indulging in forbidden pleasures or engaging in rebellious games. They were conducting systematic research into the deepest questions of human existence, developing practical techniques for transformation that continue to influence how we understand consciousness, identity, and social change. Their legacy reminds us that the most significant transformations in human history often begin not in public institutions or official programs, but in private gatherings of individuals willing to question fundamental assumptions and brave enough to experiment with alternatives. The courage to venture into psychological and social territories that conventional wisdom declares forbidden or impossible remains the essential prerequisite for genuine innovation and positive change. The shadows they cast continue to inspire and guide those who seek to understand the deeper possibilities of human nature and social organization, ensuring that their influence extends far beyond the historical period in which they lived into the ongoing evolution of human consciousness and civilization itself. Their story serves as a permanent reminder that what we consider fixed and unchangeable about human nature and society may be nothing more than temporary limitations waiting to be transcended through conscious effort, systematic experimentation, and the courage to venture beyond the boundaries that conventional thinking imposes on human possibility. The psychological warfare they waged against conventional society had reached its ultimate expression by the 1790s. What had begun as elaborate theatrical performances in underground chambers had evolved into something far more sophisticated and dangerous. The club's techniques for consciousness manipulation and social control had been refined to such a degree that they could reshape entire communities without anyone recognizing what was happening. Consider the genius of their final phase. Rather than continuing to operate as a secret society separate from mainstream institutions, they had learned to embed their methods directly into the fabric of respectable society itself. Churches, schools, governmental offices, commercial enterprises, all became vehicles for psychological techniques that had been perfected in the depths of West Wycomb's caves. A member serving as a magistrate didn't need to violate any laws or official procedures to apply club-developed insights. He simply used his enhanced understanding of human psychology to guide legal proceedings in directions that served broader objectives while appearing to follow conventional judicial practices. His ability to read unconscious motivations and manipulate emotional dynamics gave him tools for influencing outcomes that his colleagues couldn't match or even recognize. Similarly, members in educational positions could reshape young minds through techniques that appeared to be nothing more than innovative teaching methods. They understood how to encourage critical thinking and psychological flexibility while maintaining the appearance of traditional moral instruction. Students emerged from their programs with capabilities and perspectives that made them natural leaders, though they never realized how their development had been consciously guided. The transformation was so complete that the club's original underground gatherings became almost unnecessary. The psychological technologies they had developed were now operating throughout English society, carried by individuals who had internalized the techniques so thoroughly that they applied them instinctively in whatever context they encountered. The American colonial situation provided the perfect demonstration of how completely their influence had spread. The revolutionary ideas that emerged in the colonies weren't simply borrowed from European philosophers, but reflected practical applications of psychological and political insights that had been tested and refined through decades of club experimentation. Colonial leaders who had never heard of the Hellfire Club found themselves applying techniques for group organization, psychological manipulation, and social control that bore unmistakable similarities to methods that had been developed in those candle-lit chambers. The influence had spread so completely through cultural transmission that it appeared to emerge spontaneously from American circumstances rather than representing the application of foreign innovations. The French Revolutionary period showed similar patterns of unconscious influence. The psychological techniques used by revolutionary leaders to mobilize popular support, manage crowd dynamics, and create new forms of social organization reflected insights that had been pioneered by club members decades earlier. The knowledge had become part of the intellectual atmosphere of the age, available to anyone with sufficient psychological sophistication to recognize and apply it. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this final transformation was how completely it concealed its own origins. The very success of club methods in reshaping society made it impossible to trace their influence directly. The techniques had become so thoroughly integrated into normal social and political practice that they appeared natural and inevitable rather than the products of conscious innovation. Educational historians studying the development of modern pedagogical methods found sophisticated approaches to child development and learning that seemed to emerge spontaneously during the late 18th century. They had no way of knowing that these innovations reflected practical applications of psychological insights that had been gained through systematic experimentation in very different contexts. Political theorists analyzing the emergence of democratic institutions discovered sophisticated understanding of group dynamics, consensus building, and social organization that appeared to develop naturally from Enlightenment philosophy. The deeper psychological foundations that had been established through transgressive ritual experimentation remained invisible to academic analysis. Economic historians examining the development of industrial capitalism found innovative approaches to worker management, organizational psychology, and market analysis that seemed to emerge from practical business experience. The underground laboratories where these insights had been first developed and tested left no traces in official records or public documentation. The club's ultimate achievement was making itself disappear so completely that even its most profound influences appeared to be natural developments in human social evolution. They had succeeded in transforming the fundamental psychological and social structures of Western civilization while leaving no fingerprints on their accomplishments. The techniques they had developed for consciousness alteration became standard elements in religious practice, though congregations had no idea that their spiritual experiences were being enhanced through methods that had been perfected in blasphemous ceremonies. The psychological insights they had gained through sexual experimentation informed approaches to marriage, family life, and social relationships that appeared to emerge from conventional moral wisdom. The political innovations they had pioneered through underground experimentation became foundational elements in democratic theory and practice, though political scientists traced their origins to abstract philosophical speculation rather than practical testing in secret gatherings. The social control methods they had refined through years of careful observation became standard tools for managing large organizations and communities, though administrators believed they were applying common sense rather than sophisticated psychological technology. The transformation was so complete that by the beginning of the 19th century, the original club members could observe their techniques being applied throughout society by individuals who had no knowledge of their true origins. Teachers, ministers, politicians, business leaders, military officers, all were unconsciously employing methods that had been developed through systematic transgression of every moral and social boundary their society recognized as sacred. The irony was perfect. A secret society dedicated to mocking and undermining conventional authority had succeeded so completely that their methods had become the foundation for new forms of authority that were far more sophisticated and effective than anything that had existed before. They had achieved the ultimate victory by making their rebellion invisible even to themselves. The psychological architecture they had constructed continued to operate long after its original builders had passed from the scene. The networks of relationship and influence that had been created through shared transgressive experiences evolved into new forms that served similar functions while operating under different symbolic systems and social justifications. Masonic lodges, gentlemen's clubs, professional associations, educational institutions, charitable organizations, all provided environments where individuals could experience the kind of psychological transformation and social bonding that had been pioneered in the Hellfire Club's underground chambers. The specific rituals and symbols changed, but the underlying psychological mechanisms remained constant. The women who had played such crucial roles in the club's experimental work similarly found new venues for applying their sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. Salon hostesses, educational reformers, charitable organizers, cultural patrons, all carried forward insights that had been gained through participation in activities that polite society could never acknowledge. Their influence on the development of women's roles and capabilities was profound but completely hidden from contemporary observers. The psychological sophistication and social skills that had been developed through club participation made them natural leaders in whatever fields they entered, though their true qualifications could never be publicly recognized or officially documented. The children and grandchildren of club members inherited psychological capabilities and social advantages that seemed to emerge naturally from superior breeding and education. They possessed intellectual flexibility, emotional resilience, and social competence that made them extraordinarily effective leaders in politics, business, and cultural development. These inherited advantages compounded over generations as club-influenced families intermarried and created networks of relationship that concentrated psychological sophistication and social influence within increasingly connected elite circles. The original club's experimental discoveries became part of the genetic and cultural DNA of families that would dominate English and American development for centuries. The educational innovations that had been pioneered through club influence continued to evolve and spread through elite educational institutions that trained the next generation's leaders. Schools that appeared to provide conventional classical education were actually applying sophisticated psychological techniques that developed capabilities and perspectives that conventional education couldn't match. Students who emerged from these programs possessed intellectual and psychological advantages that made them natural leaders regardless of their specific career choices. They could adapt to changing circumstances, read human motivations accurately, and influence social dynamics in ways that seemed almost supernatural to those who lacked similar training. The business applications of club-developed insights continued to evolve as commercial and industrial development created new opportunities for applying psychological understanding to economic relationships. Entrepreneurs and managers who possessed enhanced understanding of human nature could create organizational structures and management practices that achieved superior results while maintaining better relationships with workers and partners. The financial innovations that emerged from club networks laid important foundations for modern banking and investment practices. Techniques for evaluating human psychology, alongside traditional financial metrics, created approaches to risk assessment and opportunity identification that gave practitioners enormous advantages over conventional competitors. The agricultural and industrial developments that transformed English society during this period bore unmistakable influences from psychological insights that had been gained through club experimentation. Land management practices, manufacturing techniques, and labor relations all reflected sophisticated understanding of how human psychology affected productivity and social stability. The legal and governmental innovations that emerged during the same period similarly incorporated psychological insights that had been developed through transgressive experimentation. Judicial procedures, legislative processes, and administrative practices all evolved in ways that reflected enhanced understanding of how human beings actually behaved in group situations under various forms of pressure and incentive. The religious and cultural developments that characterized the period showed equal influence from club-pioneered techniques for consciousness, alteration, and social manipulation. Evangelical movements, educational reforms, and cultural innovations all applied psychological methods that had been perfected through systematic exploration of forbidden territories of human experience. The international influence of club-developed techniques continued to spread through diplomatic, commercial, and cultural channels that connected England with the broader Atlantic world. Associates in other countries adapted and refined the psychological insights they had gained through club connections, creating local variations that served similar functions while reflecting different cultural contexts. The American development during this period showed particularly strong influence from club-connected networks. The political institutions, economic practices, and cultural innovations that characterized the early republic reflected practical applications of insights that had been gained through systematic experimentation with alternative forms of social organization. The French Revolutionary and post-revolutionary periods demonstrated similar patterns of unconscious influence from club-developed techniques. The psychological methods used to mobilize popular support, manage social change, and create new institutional structures bore unmistakable similarities to approaches that had been pioneered decades earlier in very different contexts. The Industrial Revolution that was simultaneously transforming economic and social relationships throughout the Western world provided additional opportunities for applying club-developed insights to large-scale organizational challenges. The psychological understanding that had been gained through intimate experimentation proved valuable for managing the complex human dynamics involved in technological and social transformation. The ultimate measure of the club's success was how completely their innovations had become invisible. By the middle of the 19th century, techniques that had been developed through systematic transgression of moral and social boundaries had become standard elements in respectable society's toolkit for managing human relationships and social organization. Educational psychologists studying child development discovered sophisticated techniques for facilitating learning and psychological growth that seemed to emerge naturally from scientific observation. They had no way of knowing that these methods reflected practical applications of insights that had been gained through systematic exploration of consciousness alteration and identity transformation. Political scientists analyzing democratic institutions found complex understanding of group dynamics, leadership psychology, and social organization that appeared to develop organically from Enlightenment rationalism. The transgressive experimentation that had provided the psychological foundation for these innovations remained completely hidden from academic investigation. Business theorists examining organizational effectiveness discovered advanced approaches to human resource management, motivational psychology, and social coordination that seemed to emerge from practical commercial experience. The underground laboratories where these techniques had been first developed and tested left no traces in corporate records or business school curricula. Religious historians studying spiritual development found sophisticated methods for facilitating transcendent experience, community building, and moral transformation that appeared to represent natural evolution in religious practice. The blasphemous ceremonies, where these techniques had been perfected, remained invisible to theological scholarship. The psychological sciences that emerged during the 19th and 20th centuries discovered principles of human development, social influence, and consciousness modification that seemed to represent original scientific insights. The systematic experimentation that had anticipated these discoveries by decades or centuries was never recognized or acknowledged by academic psychology. The therapeutic innovations that revolutionized approaches to mental health and personal development incorporated techniques that had been pioneered through transgressive experimentation in altered states of consciousness and identity transformation. The origins of these methods in activities that conventional morality would condemn as depraved remained completely hidden from medical and psychological practitioners. The club's influence on contemporary life extends far beyond anything most people could imagine. The psychological techniques that were developed through their systematic exploration of forbidden territories of human experience have become so thoroughly integrated into modern social and institutional practice that they appear natural and inevitable rather than the products of conscious innovation. Educational methods that facilitate critical thinking and psychological development reflect insights that were gained through systematic experimentation with consciousness alteration and identity transformation. Therapeutic approaches that help individuals integrate fragmented aspects of personality incorporate techniques that were perfected through transgressive ritual practices. Management strategies that enhance organizational effectiveness apply psychological understanding that was developed through systematic exploration of group dynamics under conditions of shared transgression. Political techniques that build consensus and maintain social stability utilize insights about human psychology that were gained through systematic experimentation with alternative forms of social organization. Cultural practices that facilitate community building and individual development incorporate methods that were pioneered through systematic exploration of consciousness. Altering activities, even the most mundane aspects of contemporary social life, reflect influences from psychological technologies that were developed through systematic transgression of moral and social boundaries. The ways we organize families, conduct business, practice religion, educate children, and manage communities all incorporate insights that were gained through activities that polite society would condemn if their true origins were recognized. The shadows cast by those underground chambers continue to shape our world in ways that remain invisible to most observers. The courage to venture into forbidden territories of human experience, the systematic exploration of consciousness and social organization, the development of practical techniques for transformation and influence, all continue to drive innovation and positive change, though their origins remain hidden in the depths of historical secrecy. The ultimate lesson of the Hellfire Club story may be that the most profound transformations in human development often emerge from the willingness to question fundamental assumptions and explore possibilities that conventional wisdom declares impossible or immoral. The techniques they developed through systematic transgression continue to facilitate human growth and social progress, ensuring that their influence extends far beyond the historical period in which they lived into the ongoing evolution of human consciousness and civilization. Their legacy reminds us that what we consider fixed and unchangeable about human nature and social organization may be nothing more than temporary limitations, waiting to be transcended through conscious effort, systematic experimentation, and the courage to venture beyond the boundaries that conventional thinking imposes on human possibility. The story of their transformation from transgressive secret society to invisible foundation of modern civilization demonstrates that the most effective way to change the world may be to make those changes so complete and natural that they become invisible even to those who benefit from them. In the end, the Hellfire Club achieved something that few organizations in human history have accomplished. They succeeded in fundamentally transforming the psychological and social foundations of Western civilization while leaving no trace of their involvement in that transformation. Their techniques became so thoroughly integrated into normal social practice that they appear to be natural developments in human social evolution rather than the products of systematic experimentation by individuals who were willing to risk everything to explore the deepest possibilities of human consciousness and social organization. The underground chambers where they conducted their transgressive experiments have long since fallen silent, but the psychological technologies they developed continue to operate throughout our world, facilitating human development and social progress in ways that their original creators could hardly have imagined. Their greatest achievement was making their rebellion so complete that it became invisible, ensuring that their influence would continue to shape human development long after their names were forgotten and their activities dismissed as historical curiosities.